So it was finally time to do one of my favorite modifications to the car, which I feel it really needs, especially with the deep dish rear wheels, and that's lowering the car. I had so many comments over the years of people saying, nice 4x4 stance, when are you going to lower it, you know, blah blah blah. And I didn't really care. I didn't think it was that bad the way it looked, but it would have looked better lowered. And the Bullet was lowered with a set of Ibach Pro springs. And as far as springs go, the Ibach Pros don't drop it as much as the Ibach Sport lines, which are a red spring, and the H&R SS, H&R Super Sport springs. Those are very popular, and a lot of people like those, and they drop the car a pretty good amount. And then the SR Performance ones are actually pretty good too. They're blue. I think they're made by American Muscle. And so those are the springs that everyone is always asking or talking about. Some people don't want it to drop too low of a ride height. Some people do. So that's just something to consider. But looking at the car, you can see that the ride height was about so. I could stick my hand in it sideways. And so that would be basically a whole hand, 4 fingers straight in there between the top of the tire and the top of the wheel well. And so, yeah, it is quite a bit of a gap. It really is. And I think the car would look a lot better lowered. So the interesting thing about this was I wanted to buy lowering springs for the car. I planned on buying H&R Super Sports. But my cousin was keeping his red Mach 1 at my house, and he had made an agreement where he wanted to pay a certain amount every month for storage, and he wasn't paying it, and he said, why don't you go ahead and just trade some parts off the car, and plus he might have had to get rid of the car soon, so he said, why don't you go ahead and just trade the parts you want for payment. And it came down to the point where I said, okay, I'd like the lowering springs off your car because it looked really good. I thought they were Ibach Sport lines because the car sat pretty low and it looked good. So here's a picture of what his Mach 1 looked like with lowering springs, and to me I thought the car looked like everything was great and that it was a nice lowering spring, and I thought that compared to my Bullet, which had the Ibach Pros, I thought that his had the lower Ibach Sport lines, which would be a red spring. And so I went out to the side of my house where his car was and started to take the suspension apart. And I wasn't going to cannibalize the car. I was just going to take the lowering springs and caster camber plates out and then put my Mach 1's stock pieces back in, which were a nice thing to give back because the springs in my Mach 1 only had about 80,000 miles or so on them, and they were nice. And this Mach 1 had about 140,000 miles on it, although the springs, I don't know when they were changed. Actually, they must have been there for quite a while, because you'll see why. But anyway, this is the Mach 1 taking all the suspension apart, and these are the caster camber plates he had, kind of a no-name, just aftermarket plate. The Grip brand, looks like it says. But anyway, I got the iBox springs out, and I got them into the back of the car. It looks pretty good back here. And then I realized when I got the front ones out that one of them was sheared in half, and that's probably why the car sat so low. So now I was in trouble because I had 2 Mustangs taken apart in my garage and in my driveway, both undrivable at this point, and I was trying to figure out what I would do about it. Now, if you're wondering why I have an orange flag on my antenna, that is to make sure that I remember to close the hood. I started doing that. I put a microfiber towel or an orange flag or something on there because I had the hoods open on my cars all the time. I had battery tenders on them. I drive them home. I'd open the hood when I get done from a long drive so that the heat could get out and not discolor the hood, especially if it didn't have an insulator on the bottom of it like my Orange Cobra or my Bullet had. And so that's what that's all about. But anyway, I had the Mach 1 sitting here like this with all the suspension torn out of it, and I was trying to decide what to do. I could put my Mach 1's springs and everything in the red car and then leave my blue Mach 1 in pieces until I ordered new springs for the car, which is kind of counterproductive because the whole reason I was doing this was to receive payment from my cousin for everything and all the work involved, and so I didn't really want to have to buy springs when all was said and done, although I would have if it came down to it. Or I could have just put my springs back in my car and waited, but then I thought, well, I already have it torn apart. Why would I put the stock ones back in it? There's no reason to do that. I really want lowering springs in the car, so at this point I might as well leave it apart until I can order new springs. And what ended up happening was I talked around with some friends, And one of my friends who had the Kenny Bell supercharged Mustang GT that's been on the channel, I've made videos about it, turned into a turbo car later, he had done a tubular K-member with coilovers in the front, with race coilovers. So that was perfect. He said, hey, I have extra springs and I don't need them, and they're just the fronts. And I thought, perfect, because that's exactly what I need. I just need front springs. And so he said they're SR Performance, which lower the car pretty nicely in the front. They look good. And you're not going to really notice that they're a mismatched set of springs unless you make a YouTube video about it and tell the whole world, right? But I do tell a lot of people when they ask me what the setup is on the Mach 1 because they say it sits perfect. And I tell them, well, it's actually SR Performance springs in the front and Ibach Pros in the back. And so it was a pretty good setup and it looked good. And it gets really complicated because then I bought my red Mach 1 and it said it had SR Performance springs all the way around. But when I got to it, I noticed that the rear ones were stock springs in the back and the SRs were only in the front, but it sat perfect and it looked low. And I took the isolators out of the rear and it sat perfect. And so I had 2 extra SR rear springs at that point. So then when I got my yellow Mach 1, I thought, okay, all I have to do is buy 2 new front springs for the yellow one. And I ended up getting a set of Ibach Pro springs for the front of the car. And the reason why too is because I had 1 good spring and 1 broken spring. So all this time I was thinking I could just buy 1 spring on eBay and have a nice set of lowering springs because I had the extra SRs from the rear of the red Mach 1 that were never used. And so I did end up buying a new set of front only Ibach Pros for the yellow Mach 1 because I got on eBay looking for one and I just couldn't find one. I found somebody who was selling just the fronts because it came out of a 99 Cobra and they weren't selling the IRS rear springs, they were just selling the front normal springs. So my cars are kind of like between the 2 Mach 1s, I have a full set of Ibach Pros and a full set of SR Performance springs. It's just one car has a set on the front and different on the back, and it's reverse on the other Mach 1. So it's really complicated. It's kind of funny, and that's why I'm telling the story. But anyway, I got those front springs in, and then I noticed that when I went to do the caster camber plates, I have this Steeda strut tower bar that came with my Mach 1. It was there when I bought it. I didn't install this on the car. But the problem was the Steeda bar would not fit with the caster camber plates. They were just too close and they were rubbing it, so I had to remove the Steeda bar and I just put it in my garage. And so then I put the caster camber plates on the car and it was great. So I lowered the car and I didn't quite like how the back was sitting because I wanted to go without the rear isolators, but I left them in there just to be safe. And I know we're looking at the Blue Bullet right now, and the reason why is because I liked how much it lowered the back of the Mach 1 with no isolators, just in the rear, and it was so easy to do that I immediately pulled the wheels off and pulled the isolators out of the rear of the Bullet's springs and did that in like 20 minutes, and it sat lower too, so I like that. So the Ibach Pros don't lower the car as much as I'd like it to, but here it is in the rear of the car and it didn't have isolators and there's no noise or anything, and so both the cars sit a little lower. In this picture you can see on the right the Mach 1 has no isolators. On the left the Bullet still had the isolators, and there is a pretty good gap difference there. So I took out the isolators out of the Bullet and made sure both cars have no rear isolators. And so the cars did sit really low now, and then the question that always comes up, do your fenders cut into your tires? And the answer for that is if I get on just the right tilt, they would rub and they would cut into it. So I did roll the fenders on the Mach 1 and the Bullet, and I used a fender rolling tool. And people might not know what a fender roller is. They think it's actually like rolling the whole body of the wheel well up underneath, and maybe some people do it that way. But the fender roller's job is to take the flat sheet metal inside the wheel well. You can see where it's contacting on that red wheel, and folding it up just slightly. It's not doing anything to the side of the wheel well. It's just taking the flat sheet metal that goes almost level with the top of the tire and just gently folding it up so that it can't cut into the side of the tire when you go into dips or get the suspension really low. And so the way to do this correctly is to use a heat gun and get the paint work really nice and warm. You don't want to overheat it and bubble and ruin your paint, but you want to get it nice and warm and spend some time so that when you do use that roller, you're not cracking the paint. And in theory, you can get the heat in the wheel well there on the paint and the clear coat and get it all softened up, and then when you gently use that wheel on the roller, it will fold that metal and the paint and bend the paint without cracking it if it was cold. So I did it and it worked pretty well, but it still did a little bit of crack in the wheel well, so I put some primer on it. It's way up in there, you'll never see it. And so you can see that the the roller is kind of in the middle there, and that's okay to roll the middle, but the place where it contacts the tires the most are on each end of the wheel well, where it curves. Not so much the top curve, but on each side, like close to the rear bumper there, and then over by the side scoop there. But you don't have to do the part that's by the side skirt way down there, because that's never going to rub. It's just probably the top like banana shaped part, and mostly on the ends of that banana shaped part. So I know it's difficult to explain, but you want to be careful. You want to use a heat gun, because sometimes people will do it and it will crack the paint all the way up the side of the quarter panel. So you really don't want that to happen either. And so now the car was sitting pretty good, and every time you do lowering springs on a car, it takes about a day for those springs to settle, and it will drop down a little bit more than it is. So in these pictures, this is right after it was done, they look pretty good. The springs look like they're sitting all right. You can see the gap is a lot less, but they're not quite settled yet either. And I did leave the isolators in the front of the car just because I didn't know if it would squeak or have problems, and that's harder to change than the rears. Some people will wrap the springs in electrical tape instead of using isolators. There's all sorts of things people do, but this is about what the wheel looked like, and it did settle a little bit more than that. So now the car is finally looking the way I like it the most. Exterior wise, on a Mach 1, I believe it only needs the deep dish rear wheels. It needs to be lowered a little bit, and possibly the blackout panel between the taillights with the honeycomb, depending on how much you like it. I did that to my red Mach 1. I didn't want to do that to this car because the paint was so nice. But I do like the honeycomb panel, shorty antenna, and window tint. Other than that, I don't think it needs anything else exterior wise. Of course, the catback exhaust is nice. It has a nice exhaust with bigger tips, but this is how I love the way the Mach 1 looks. This is my favorite look. And so I've had 4 Mach 1s now, and 3 of them were set up with lowering springs and the deep dish rear AFS wheels. I still have the 2 Mach 1s, the yellow one and this blue one. And so these are just some of my favorite pictures of how the car looks lowered with the deep dish wheels. The car looks fantastic. I smile every time I look at it. To me, it's perfection. You know, some people want to go really low with coilovers and bags and stuff. I think this is perfect. This is perfect wheel clearance, perfect wheel gap. It's not too bad, and I can still drive around town and not scrape on things. And so this is how I like it. So this looks really good, especially with the SLP exhaust. And these are some of my favorite pictures of the car. So just like I said before, the older pictures I have of the car when it wasn't lowered with the rear wheels on it, just the way I like it, are kind of hard to look at now because I know the car is not sitting how I love it, and I absolutely love it now. So it's hard to look back at those old pictures and almost just kind of cringe and be like, it just doesn't look right. No, I love the Mach 1 the way it is, and if somebody has a super nice one and it's all stock, I appreciate that too. But if people ask me, what do I think the Mach 1 should look like? What wheels should it have? What does it need? And my response is basically to make it look like this. And that's what I tell everybody. A lot of people ask my opinion, and they ask me why I like it this way, and I think it should look like a Mach 1 with the same style wheels. I think it should be a little bit lower, just because the reason why it's not this low from the factory is because it has to make everybody happy, and there are people who don't want the car low, and they want to be able to drive over speed bumps, and the car has to be able to do certain things with a certain ride height. And so I understand why it was made that way, but I think this is what the car should look like. I think this really makes it look perfect. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Still more to come. We'll have some more really cool pictures with the car set up the way I like it now. And so it was hard to get to this point of the progress of the car, but now the car's finally how I like it cosmetically. And so we'll have more updates on the car and more stories about it as we continue this playlist about the history of the Mach 1. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Stay tuned for more Mustang content.